And so very happy to see you all. Welcome to the panel entitled Post-Development Approaches Towards Just and Sustainable Adaptation to Climate Change. The main motivation, I think, behind this panel is just this observation that there are a lot of, like, majority of the approaches now towards adapting to climate change are really top-down, relying on techno-infrastructural solutions such as building seawalls or elevating roads. But a review of this adaptation programs just recently, the group of Siri Erickson reviewed 34 different adaptation interventions in the journal World Development, and they saw that most of these are really not producing the kind of just and sustainable outcomes that what the projects intended to do. So that's why the goal of this panel is really to draw out, to bring to the fore some of the lessons that we can learn that can support, drawing on diverse economies, post-development, care ethics. What can we learn from engaging with, communities, with more than human, with indigenous knowledge in adapting to climate change? And so this is my proposed schedule for this afternoon. It's flexible, but feel free to, I just wanted to ask for your thoughts if you're happy for this presentation flow. What I'm proposing is that we present, and then towards the end, we do an open forum, like a 30-minute to talk about all the papers. Are you happy with that? Or did you want us to do an open forum right after each presentation? Oh, we can also do that. Is everyone happy with this? Good. And then at the end, for the last 30 minutes, I pitched this idea to the group, to the panel, and they're very happy to contribute to a joint, like a publication that will highlight the different lessons from this panel. So basically, weaving together the different lessons that you can learn from the different case studies in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and in Fiji. So that's the end. Towards the end of the presentation is to have a bit of a discussion on that. I can't see, oh, there. I was looking for Suli. Is that Suli? Okay. So do you have any questions? All right, then without further ado, let's start with our first presenter, Kelly Dombrowski and Huong Tino, diverse more than human approaches to climate change adaptation in Thai Binh, Vietnam.
Thank you. How am I connecting now? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, that's cool. Let me share my screen. Show all windows. Where is my presentation? Seems to be gone. Oh, sorry, this hasn't happened to me before. Normally it just appears as the thing that I want to share. Here it is. Okay, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. As I think I know all of you, my name's Kelly Dombrowski, and I'm presenting today on behalf of my back in the Vietnam Institute of Meteorology, a paper that's built on research, and it's built on her PhD research, where she spent a long time in the field in Thai Binh, which I need to acknowledge I've never visited. So I'm presenting today on behalf of the both of us. Huong has a very busy job, and I get paid to do this kind of thing. So I've pulled it together just for today, but I just want to acknowledge that this is really mainly built on Huong's work. It's a paper that we submitted to the Asia Pacific Viewpoint special one. Oh, is it still cutting in and out for me? Oh, that's old. The special issue that Catherine and Dorji and I are editing. And it's called Diverse More Than Human Approaches to Climate Change Adaptation in Taibin. And I've pretty much just going to go through and summarize the paper. And we kind of began our paper with our introduction, thinking about our disappointments and how climate change adaptation has really just been a prop for business as usual. It hasn't really delivered on what we imagined would happen when we first started thinking about climate change adaptation, which was that it would lead us to radically change our practices with regards to the economy and with regards to the way we interact with the environment or the more than human. So we kind of begin our paper with the disappointment, but we sort of look back on our naivete where we thought about the hope that there would be a different model for climate change adaptation, and if we could come up with a different model, what would it be? So based on Huang's 6 months of fieldwork in 2016 and 2017, we interrogated both the formal and informal climate change adaptation interventions related to water in Vietnam. And in the paper, we begin by trying to connect climate change adaptation to the diverse economies and community economies. And we focus on reviewing a few core papers that deliberately engage with climate change. We really began with Catherine McKinnon and Phil Ireland, I think his name is, their paper, which is in 2013, engaging with climate change adaptation and post-development. And the main message that we took away from that paper is that climate change adaptation is always going to be political, and we have to engage with the politics of climate change adaptation and not naively hope that it's always going to be in the best interests of the environment or marginalized people, for example. And the second paper that we engage with is paper by Abby Lopez and colleagues from the Cooling the Commons project, where they talk about inventorying a diverse range of adaptation strategies, including learning from to the heat. And we got from that paper that we can inventory a diverse range of strategies, and they don't have to be about hard infrastructure, and they don't have to be about building stuff to protect us from climate change, such as air conditioning units, but can be about adapting in a different kind of embodied way. Building on that embodied thinking, we reviewed a bunch of papers here. I've just picked this one as an exemplar, but there's a lot of work by Cameron, Gibson and Hill, a lot of Anne's other work and Jenny's other work with Cameron, Manhood and Pomfret, for example. And we thought about the way that we can learn to be bodily affected by climate change. So the papers here are about thinking about how we can learn to interact with climate change and notice climate change, which increases our capacity to act for something different, some other kind of climate change adaptation intervention. And the fourth strategy that the fourth paper or group of papers that we looked at is again Gibson, Graham, Cameron and Healy, and we're looking at the 2016 paper looking at the sort of hopeful approach to collective action exemplified by the solar collectives and the atmospheric collectives that are pulling together to act for change. And so we took away from that a kind of hopeful approach to collective action and attention to the more than human and climate change adaptation. So just to summarize the kind of four things we came up from our literature review is that politics are everywhere. we can begin by inventorying a hopeful approach to the possibilities of real climate change adaptation. And so we then go through each of these with Vietnam in mind, in Vietnam. And we cannot deny that politics are everywhere, including in Vietnam and including in Vietnamese climate change adaptation interventions. So Huong.
Oh no, Kelly dropped out.
Is really looked at it. Oh, thank you. Huong has been able to look at a lot of climate change adaptation interventions in Vietnam, and it is always political, and it's often a way of using the funding that's coming in for climate change adaptation and diverting towards other costs. Disappointing was seeing how one of the indicators for climate change adaptation was the number of kilometers of concrete canals that had been built. It doesn't necessarily indicate anything positive about climate change adaptation. So these are the kinds of infrastructures that are being put in place, irrigation systems for climate change adaptation in Thai Binh province in Vietnam. We then tried to move on to inventory the different kinds of strategies that local people are using based on their traditional knowledge in terms of climate change adaptation. So here are some examples. I don't know, Huong, if you want to jump in and say anything. Keep going, but jump in if you want to. Which is a concrete boat that sort of sits and waits for flooding, and then when flooding comes into play is useful for going and transporting things in flood times. So these are kind of local adaptations to climate change. Here we've got wire mesh around an aquaculture pond, and what this means is that when the pond floods, the fish cannot escape because the mesh is there. So these are other examples of climate change adaptation strategies. The other one is planting different varieties of rice on the riverbank, which reduces the erosion. And you can see the pictures here where rice is planted. This is a traditional practice for protecting riverbeds as well. So then our second or third strategy then is paying attention to the body. And this is where Huong did her learning work. And this is from a poster where farmers were engaged in, and she also got into the field and experienced a lot of this herself as well. So the feeling of the soil. Huong, can you say something about your experiences at this point?
Yes. So just like as Kelly said that I did got through with the field trip, but actually as the twice trips. So the first one is still go with a very developmentalist expert. So I'm trying to develop the kind of like very concrete indicator that can evaluate what the interventions are there. But I got kind of failure. So the second field trips, I went to the trips, I went to the field and I stay with the families, and I but just some of that, not all, of course. So it's so different when you taste the water. It's so totally different. So with the like raining water, it's kind of like soft and sweeter, and compare with the kind of like the how can I say, the underground water in the dry seasons. So it's quite smelly, not quite, but sometimes it's very smelly, and you can feel it's kind of like visceraries on that. So it also couldn't use for like washing the vegetable too, and also like with the tasting, with the difference of the rice, with the good rice and the rice it suffer from the flood. The taste is quite bitter, and different kind of like feeling with the different soils. So the soil with the farmer that they kind of like use some of them use the organic fertilizers. It's quite different with the one they use a lot of chemicals and only based on the kind of like what the government offer. Yeah, so that is some of my feelings, but I also kind of like interviews and kind of try to understanding what the farmer they feels and they kind of experience for their farming activities in relation to the government climate change adaptation intervention apply in their locals. I mean, yeah, and
Thank you. It was really fun to supervise that part of the thesis and try and think about how do we represent the kind of emotions and feelings and affect of getting dirty in the soil in our writing. So there was a lot of fun there, which we explored again in this paper as well. So I'll just quickly move on to the last thing, which is the kind of hopeful approaches and the more than human reciprocity in the paper. And we ask a bunch of questions near the end of the paper, and I'm not sure that we really answer them in this paper as well as we would like to. So we want to ask, how can climate change adaptation interventions build on what's already present, the things that farmers are already doing in the traditional knowledges? How can embodied adaptive knowledges of local communities be proliferated so that others can experience those embodied connections to soil and the embodied knowledges that that an adaptation can be based on? And then how do we resist the mastery and control narratives that the engineering-based climate change adaptation interventions are often built on, where you're kind of trying to master the environment rather than interact and listen to the more than human? And how also can policymakers start to pay attention to adaptive learning and accumulated local and local environmental knowledges? So that's kind of some questions that we try and finish with. And we start to answer them a little bit by thinking about how we can promote, as academics and as scientists and as people engaged in climate change adaptation thinking, and move from just cerebral knowledge that's sort of based on statistics or facts into a form of thinking about embodied knowledge that allows us to learn to be affected and increase our capacity to act. It's not to say that we don't need those kinds of cerebral knowledges, but we need to sort of pad them out with more embodied knowledges. We kind of ask, can humans or learn to be affected by the more than human collectively with regards to climate change adaptation interventions? And we start to say that yes, we can, and we give a few small examples of how the spread of learning to be affected by more than human happens within communities and across communities internationally. And we talk a little bit at the end of the paper about moving towards reciprocal economies with the more than human and away from extractive economies, where climate change adaptation interventions are kind of about preserving that business as usual, the extraction of the more than human for the benefit of a few. So that's where we end it. Thank you for listening, and sorry for my poor internet connection.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Paul, for a very important, very insightful presentation. I particularly like the photos from the field, because you really see, that you've really done very detailed amount of field work and very extensive field work. So congratulations on that.
thank you.
So, oh, you're just in time. So let's go now to the second presentation, which is my presentation. So I'll just load my slide. There you go. Can you see my screen? So the title of my paper is Diverse Pathways to Climate Change Adaptation Through a Post-Development Lens, the case of Tambaliza Island in the Philippines. Oops. So this is a joint paper with Catherine McKinnon and Brooke Wilson that we submitted to the journal Climate and Development. and we've just heard back from the reviewers. I think it's pretty good, but we'll see what happens. So there. So a bit of an introduction. Just start my time. So with an increasing evidence of climate change and anthropogenic climate change comes the acknowledgement of the need for humans to adapt in novel and profound ways. Why is moving on its own? I wonder why. So there's this growing consensus that humans need to adapt, and adaptation has risen in the development agenda to combat this escalating threat of climate change. In fact, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals signed by 193 countries includes urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The UN has also identified a number of targets like mainstreaming activities, mainstreaming adaptation into planning and policies, as well as capacity building, early warnings, and impact reduction. Most of these approaches are what we call techno-managerial approaches, which are still the most common adaptive response in practice. And in fact, in the review of Bassett and Fogelman, they found that 70% of adaptation responses are often techno-managerial. When you say techno-managerial, we mean that it's driven by expert rule and market-driven approaches that are often planned and are originating far from the everyday experience of the community members who experience these adverse effects of climate change in the first place. So a number of critical scholars have raised concerns that such technocratic and incremental modes of adaptation run a risk of either redistributing vulnerability or introducing new sources of vulnerability and failing to reduce inequality. It also precludes the emergence of diverse and spontaneous adaptation innovation of local communities. And so in our search for possible alternatives to these techno-managerial approaches to adaptation, we draw from post-development theory so as we can bring to the fore this diverse and community-driven everyday forms of adaptation. So by way of introduction, which I don't think you need an introduction, this theory, post-development theory, is a field of debate became prominent in development studies in the 1990s to the works of the following, like Ferguson, Escobar, and others. And the criticisms emerged from the observation that several decades of aid and intervention have done little to improve the quality of life, especially in the developing world. Drawing on post-colonial and post-structural perspectives, many of these critical assessments portray development as a form of neo-imperialism that reinforces the power of Western political, economic, and knowledge systems. However, from its early beginnings as an angry body of critique, which only saw injustice and oppression, post-development theory has evolved into this mode of assembling that seeks out opportunities and possibilities in a range of social and economic processes. And so this paper, this presentation, is situated within this new generation of post-development scholarship that does not merely point out the problem, but also theorize possible solutions by empowering alternative worldviews and perspectives and voices that are often silenced within the mainstream discourse, development discourse. So there are three threads of analytical focus that are common in this field: politics, economy, and knowledge. In politics, this is our research question. How are people engaging in political interventions that in pursuit of different diverse forms of adaptation? For the economy, we are seeking to look for these diverse economic practices that people engage in to adapt to climate change. And for knowledge, what alternative force of knowledge that people follow and value when thinking about how to adapt to climate change? So these three questions we use to structure our analysis in the empirical section of our paper. So our study area is a small island in the Philippines. So it's not in Mindanao where Anne is working, but this is in the Visayas region of the Philippines. It's a small island called Tambaliza, and approximately 775 square hectares. So it's just very small and home to only about 3,000 people. It's endowed with diverse fishery resources. It's a major fishing ground in the Philippines. The residents are also engaged in farming crops like sweet potatoes, cassava, bananas, coconuts, and corns. The majority of the residents here in Tambaniza are considered poor by national standards. The poverty incidence, or the proportion of population whose income is insufficient to meet basic household needs, is 28%, almost 28%. The table in front of you describes their access to infrastructure services, mode of transport, and quality of housing in the island. Here is the map of Tambaniza. It's divided into 7 different villages or sitios: Proper, Banban, Batos, Botlog, Ginpisahan, Pasir, and Punting. We employed participant observation, focus group discussions, and interviews as main data collection methods. The research sought to understand how the local community members were recovering from the aftermath of one of the biggest typhoons in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan, actually in history, and how externally provided adaptation aid and local adaptation innovations were taking shape in the communities. So just take note of this small island, small village here called Botlog on November 13. So as I said, that Typhoon Haiyan destroyed all the 51 houses in this particular village due to storm surges. So in principle, all the adaptation interventions should focus on this particular vulnerable village. But when I looked at the different adaptation projects implemented by the NGOs, this is what I found. This slide presents an inventory of the different adaptation interventions of the 3 international NGOs. There are a lot of NGOs, but these were the only 3 left when I did my fieldwork in 2018. The NGOs stated in their programs that several efforts were made to ensure that the right people were identified, targeted, and provided with the necessary adaptation assistance. The right people were those who were devastated by typhoons and were rendered vulnerable to extreme weather events. For instance, so the name of the NGOs have been changed. So these are pseudonyms. So you will see what they said. Sacred 8 UK, they targeted, the programs are not for the relatively strong. British for Environment, it's accounting for the needs of women, indigenous communities. First Response Ireland said that, for the more vulnerable ones in the community. However, post-development perspectives contribute to this critique of how adaptation is being implemented in Tambaniza, to demonstrate the ways that adaptation interventions are resulting to inequitable outcomes on the ground. Interviewees in the more prosperous sitios were more likely to report an intervention in their area. There are more projects in this area compared to others that are more vulnerable. For example, across the 13 categories of adaptive interventions, 10 were reported in Proper and Banban, whereas the more vulnerable sitios of Botlog and Punting, only 3 or 4 were recorded. This table also shows that the projects were concentrated in areas where the local officials and their constituents reside, which is Proper, Banban, and Ginpisahan, the 3 on the left. So a post-development perspective will open our eyes to these kinds of inequities and make us realize that this is not just a mere coincidence, but that there are political, economic, and broader factors involved. But post-development does not simply end with critique. It also helps identify a number of diverse adaptation strategies that communities are engaged in. So we attempt to highlight these strengths and assets already existing with the communities. We conducted a participatory focus group discussion with the community members to ask them to collectively identify what are the assets, the strengths, and the resources in the community that help them adapt to climate change. So these are some of the findings from that focus group. For example, the residents highlighted that they have strong ties that exist between their families and friends, exemplified through gifting and sharing of labor. They also pointed out institutional support that they receive from the local government and how these help them strengthen their adaptive capacities. They've also identified several physical environmental assets like the sea, mountains, mangroves, and other physical infrastructures like the school and the gym. So based on this map, we drew out these recurring themes and supplemented them through the interviews. So the assets map produced with the community members brought to the fore some of the ways that the residents in Tambaniza are exploiting available openings in politics to advance their goals of adaptation. two projects stood out. Bayanihan sa Botlog. So Bayanihan is cooperation, helping one another. Is this project initiated by the community members themselves to rebuild their own houses in the aftermath of typhoon. So they were able to raise, because they were able to post social media and a lot of help, donate funds to them. They were able to raise like 200,000 pesos to buy materials and rebuild their houses. The second example is where the community members themselves have gathered together to plan for future extreme weather events. So all together, they use their, so they met once a month for, I think, for a period of a year, and they try to mobilize this knowledge to be formed into a safe village guide, which can help the community members adapt and know what to do in case of typhoons in the future. In terms of economic activities, so there were two that we saw. One would be the relationship of giving and reciprocity with the community. I included this photo of fish catch because respondents from Botlog and Punting spoke about how they received these gifts of fish, of squid and crabs from their neighbors when they had large catch without expecting anything in return. So these are important to local livelihoods and underpinned by norms of reciprocity. Now, this is the second finding is through this community-based savings and banking, which I found interesting because COMSCA, it's called COMSCA. This is introduced by an NGO. But what happened was the community members themselves, they, in a way, own this kind of this savings group, and they adapted it and changed it according to their own rules, or they set their own rules, they make their own constitution, they set their own service charge and loads. So it's all up to them. So in other words, they take ownership of this kind of intervention that was introduced to them. So to date, there are now 15 groups in Tambaliza that generate up to 80,000 pesos a year. Finally, many participants voiced the use of combination of traditional forms of traditional forms of knowledge and a little bit of science to validate this kind of traditional local knowledge that they use. So these are some of the things that they look at: animal behaviors, clouds. They look at the sea. They smell the sea. They look at the wind, the direction of the wind. So these are just some of the examples that the community members use to local and traditional knowledge. In fact, that's the first one that they rely to. There's no electricity in this small island. So they rely first and foremost on this, and they try to validate that with scientific knowledge. And in the same way, scientific knowledge of the NGOs are also used to, in a way, they also validate that from the field, from the data on the ground. So it's like both are validating one another. And both are, so there's this kind of entanglement that's happening between the two. So in conclusion, climate change adaptation has emerged as a new theme in development. And we have this critical research tradition like political ecology, climate justice. So they made all of these critiques, but I think, yes, these efforts are welcome and necessary, but I think we need to move beyond critique, and we need to rethink how we can do the practice of adaptation differently. So we stress the need to imagine different, diverse ways of doing adaptation. Those that will simply rely on business-oriented or growth or technological approaches. So what can we learn? First, post-development approach enables us to contribute to existing critiques of how adaptation is conceptualized and implemented in practice. Second, post-development approach opens up space to recognize that people have the capacity and means to adapt to climate change on their own, and that NGOs and governments have an important role to support them in these endeavors. Ultimately, our research demonstrates that diverse adaptation pathways are possible. They occur beyond techno-managerial and mainstream approaches to adaptation. These are driven by community members themselves who build on their existing strengths, knowledges, assets, and experiences within this community. So I think that's the end of my presentation. And I also have a good news that my paper, so I wrote a paper on this, the NGOs and the inequitable outcomes. And just today, I got the note officially that it will be published in the journal Climatic Change. So finally, after 1 year, it will be published. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone. and looking forward to your questions later. So we now go to our third presenter, which is Suli Vunibola. He will be presenting on the topic Indigenous Innovations and Climate Resilience, Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Climate Smart Agricultural Approach in the Pacific. So Suli, you have the floor.
Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can hear. We can see it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to. Well, I don't know what's wrong with this. Full screen?
Is it also clicking on its own? That's my experience a while ago.
It looks good now.
Looks good. Yeah. All right. Kia ora koutou katoa, Nisambula Vinaka. Thank you for this opportunity to present. I am Suli. I'm teaching with Kelly. That's why on your screen you can see Kelly Dombrowski's name, because I've been running around here and there trying to get my family down to Christchurch here in New Zealand, and been facing a lot of problem. I'm in a new house and internet is up and down. And I just asked Kelly, can you send me the link? So she sent it to me. That's why I can see her name there. So I'm a lecturer with Kelly for geography at the University of Canterbury. So the presentation today is on Indigenous innovations and climate resilience. Basically, it's something from my PhD, which I looked at Indigenous entrepreneurship in the Pacific, focusing on Fiji. And two of the businesses that I studied from the 7 we studied all over the Pacific, 2 of those were agriculture based. But I'm using one of that in this presentation, plus a kind of social enterprise or for my accent research project. So I went to the field, looked at the model, and I tried to initiate the same initiative in a different location, which have been struggling, being documented by the government as being poor in their own indicators in terms of money. But those kind of communities are cashless communities in most of the ways, but they eat the healthiest food, they live peaceful life, they don't pay debt, but our economic system doesn't recognize that. So I'm so lucky to engage a lot with diverse community economies, and teaching as well really gave me a lot of ideas around that. So I'm looking at Indigenous innovation, and sorry, close this door, there's some kids. Looking at trying to reconceptualize Indigenous innovation from a diverse cultural viewpoint, because innovation usually link up with technological advancement, innovation, whereby things kept on changing, gadgets and stuff, link up to technological revolution, as well as it linked up to some Schumpeter's neoclassical economic progress, where money is everything about innovation. So what I'm looking at is how do we reconceptualize innovation? So my thinking was, okay, as a Pacifica, I'm an Indigenous Fijian. Our ancestors sailed across the Pacific to and fro when no aeroplane was invented. The study of aerodynamics. So our ancestors studied how the sail, how that aerodynamic theoretical idea now, but they study the sail and how that can walk to and against the winds, and also hydrodynamics, how the body of double hull canoes can carry 300 to 500 people capacity. That was their innovation. and they sailed across into through the ocean without even the modern technology. So I'm trying to motivate myself. Okay, let's look at innovation that way and see how indigenous Fijians or in the Pacific can use those motivations to, to look at what are some of the ways to go forward in order to support their well-being. So this presentation examined the crucial contributions of indigenous enterprises and community-driven projects in Fiji, as well as for my PhD, we just looked at the business model, how they redistribute surplus, not only in terms of money and profit maximization, but how do they contribute to other community practices, cultural ethos, and so forth. And as well as looking at the Pacific, which are contexts vulnerable to climate crisis, but have adopted some form of climate smart strategies. So, oh gosh, I didn't do that. Yeah. So these are the two case studies in Fiji, in Vanuatu, which is the island on top of the map. That's Vanuatu. This is where these two case studies are located. One is Nairambali Youth Farm, and the Kirivi Nasaroni Community Project is the one that I tried to initiate. I initiated on the ideas, what I learned on the field, try to analyze data on field and try to initiate that. So my main perspective was Fiji has been going through dramatic changes in terms of land tenure systems, whereby even our land trust system and institutions, which is called It's Okay Land Trust Board, who are supposed to work in accordance with the interest of landowners, are more corporate focused. So it's, they're like serving the interest of foreign investors to come in. And now these foreign investors are growing agricultural commodities, which used to be grown by indigenous peoples. And even I'm here in New Zealand, when I try to eat taro or cassava, which are our form of potatoes, then I have to buy from a dairy shop with a brand on it. And those brands are these foreign investors taking over the land. And the indigenous people are now become their laborers, with the government coming in to say, hey, this is good for investors coming in, and we know the story of what goes on from there. So it's not only I want to run the business, but it's not only for poverty alleviation, but it's also for land retention, because that is the only catch which they can protect the land is to use it. We have to change the perspective from just plain custodian of the land, because many of the land in Fiji, we are the custodian of those land, we leave it like that, because it supports biodiversity, support all these life systems, etc. But the neoliberal ideology that government and from external forces said that you need to use the land, otherwise you are lazy. Okay, so I studied Nairambali Youth Farm is like a millionaire rural youth farm initiated by a village group or a youth group, and everything is manually done. They no machineries, and they've been thinking of what shall we. This was like 15 years ago, and they started from the same place where I started, like to start something small, and then build on from there. And they just walked through the idea of passion. What was their passion? What was the crops that they want to grow? Nothing else. And now they even during COVID-19, they built a few houses, and they withdrew $10 million from their bank account without any assistance from the government or any other institutions. That's during COVID-19. When we talk about resilience, when we talk about this village-based, out of grid, they don't even have roads to their village. And in order to do that during COVID-19, when tourism, the backbone of the country in Fiji, was nosediving. So the detail of that is in my PhD. If you need it, then I can send it over. The other one is, this is where I tried to replicate, to learn what shall we do when we initiate an initiative like this. So started in a community. Yes, they have the land, but they don't have the planting materials. They don't have the perspective, and even they don't have any belief at all that they can do it, because they've been struggling all along with life. So we started small, growing the crops that they understood or where the ancestors had been growing. And the model that, and we talk about this, understanding about diverse community economies, like for indigenous regions, there are many institutions that govern people's life. One is Vanua, meaning the indigenous regions as an identity. It can mean land, can also mean your relation, people. It's a holistic understanding and a holistic term that describe the totality of not only living, but also non-living, spirituality, etc., the general culture of indigenous region. And the role that people play within that is like social obligation, cultural obligations, gatherings over and over again that people need to contribute, people need to go and attend. And we have the families. Now the families have different roles. They need to support children's kids' education, as well as high school education or tertiary education, which is so expensive, as well as the life as of the family. And most of them are Christian after colonialism, as well as we have the government. And imagine they have roles, not only to attend workshops or meetings, they also need to, some of them need levies. They need levies to pay for the church, and they need money and food and cultural artifact for Vanua obligations. And for the government, if they are visiting the village, then everybody need to bring potluck or contribute to some sort of an expense to look after government people visiting. So when running a business in these kind of communities, we need to look at all those as sociocultural obligations or responsibilities. So we have the input support mechanisms, which I can discuss later on, and we have the business having many roles and how do they distribute surplus. Okay, now to the agricultural practices, which is based on indigenous knowledge systems. So this is a thematic analysis of what happened in both the locations. One is Yavoi or TV Drumat, which means multi-cropping. Our ancestors have been doing this all over their life. They plant many crops in a particular area, and that really assisted in terms of nutrients uptake, pest resilience, land. But there's only a few people are doing it. For example, these two groups. Otherwise, people are doing massive monocropping and commercialization, which lead to drastic measures like spraying chemicals and so forth. The other one is Vakavovo, which is a term used for following. So our people, our elders use this when they farm a particular area, they leave it to follow, to rest. It needs resting for one whole year. So what they do, they usually get beans. And now when I was doing my PhD at Mass University, there was a guy from the Pacific, and I had a close, we had been working together in some of the ways about looking at this variety of following crop, which is a bean called mukuna. And it is a nitrogen fixation, a legume plant, and that really contributed back to nitrogen and other nutrients in the soil, as well as when they follow, they use, because of intercropping, mixed cropping or multi-cropping, they used to have like tree crops which remains there, and we call that ikanakana, means to feed from. That means you don't leave it, you still visit it to get the food from these tree crops to feed your family. The other one is they also use composting, which is called ravuni, ravusa, or susuni, which means they burn dead corals and shells after eating them, and they also do composting, mix them all together, which provide a lot of nutrients like potassium, calcium, as well as green manure as a form of carbon, and then mix it with poultry manure, and then the combination or the ratio between the carbon and the poultry manure, which means that it can open up, the nutrients can really be used up by the plant with the right proportion. And it had been used by elders before. Now people are going back organic as a brand, but it had been there like for many cultural groups all over the world who had been living this way. And now the reviving of Vale Vale, or the greenhouse. And when I came to New Zealand, I walked in a few orchards and I said, oh, we used to have the same philosophies, the same ideology, where people grow crops under thatch roof or coconut leaves or branches. And now they're doing it because, for example, cover is a commodity. When due to climate change, it's so hot, you plant the cover stems into the soil, it may dry up and die. But when you grow it, like after 3 months, they fully develop leaf systems and root system, and then you plant it out into the farm, then it can resist the sun. So they've been learning a lot and reaching back to what our elders who had been doing. So this is what happened. There are massive shifting cultivation going on. For example, where I come from, people are, the mass removal of forest is not by logging or lumbering. It's because of shifting cultivation. Even hardwood, which grows take hundreds of years to grow, they just cut it down and to establish their farm. So what they've been trying to do, and I've also ran a few workshops with them, is the idea of how our elders did it in the past. They leave hardwood on the farm rather than removing everything. So in these two pictures, the one on my left, maybe on your right or whatever, there are still hardwood growing with coffee. And then the one on the other one, which is a cover farm, they've removed everything. So the ability for the soil health and for them to reuse it, and for that to support their livelihood is more when hardwood is there, and water holding capacities of the soil has more probability with hardwood still established on the land. The other one is Bulabakaviti lunar calendar. They've been, and practices of our elders had been around their lunar calendar, but it's so sorry to hear now that everything is changing. That means they need to readapt because all of what they had been doing is through assessment, through evaluation, through observation, and that's how, oh, this is the month where we have this kind of fish. This is where we can dig this tropical yam or whatever. Now it's changing and they need to readapt as well. The other one is Solesolevaki, an indigenous communal labor, now has been used as for the market labor as well, whereby they work together in groups and take turns in doing a farm for a particular village or a particular family, and then tomorrow will be for another one. Because if you plant your taro or crop, it takes 1 hour for you to weed and plant 50 or 100, depends on the land. But if there are plenty, then you can have, in a day, 1,000 plants. So reviving these traditional mechanisms is really important in terms of coherence, their relationship, but as well as the value, what they can produce to support their food security, support their well-being, as well as some form of income as well. Which is the next practice I've found out. It's about diverse community economies. I thought that I'll do it with the youth from my external research, but I realized later on that the women, I don't start it. They started, because the youth are doing that, now we are doing this. So the women revived traditional weaving, handicrafts, and then these are the children in the middle who were not able to go to school during COVID-19. As of now, we are doing a program on teaching them, indigenous knowledge through agriculture, And this is the picture where they had been growing their native trees. They select their totems or their native trees from the forest, bring it to the thatch houses, look after it for like 3 to 5 months, and then we plant it back onto the land, especially for this one near a small creek which had been barren for a long time. And then the development of food security system for the whole village. As I've said before, they don't only feed their families, they feed the many responsibilities. When the government people come to the village, when there is a traditional obligation, a marriage ceremony, or whatever gathering, they need food as well. So instead of getting food from their family farm, they get food from the communal farm, which we established as part of the project. The other one is the other way to which is work schedules. And this is a response to, because many of these youths are educated, they've been trained, but we call them, they are called in Fiji dropout from the school system. So they go back to the village. All their life, they had been working with routine that through the schools, bell, wake up time, sleep time. But when they go to the village, it's a laid back lifestyle. That's why they are called, oh, you are lazy, you can't do anything, because it conflicted with what needed in the village. Through the education, it's through individualism. They need to study, you can copy during exam, but in the village, they need collectivity. But for them, that's a totally new concept of working together. So it's more of rethinking, of trying, of struggling. And I said, the project that I'm engaging in, the Action Research Project, we're struggling to get people together, to work together. So working in groups, in monthly activities, for every month, there are 4 different activities. Week 1 for youth farm, week 2 for individual farm, tribal security for week 3, and 4 for all the socio-cultural obligations. So we talk to the chiefs, we talk to the government, we talk to the Vanua elders, and we tell them, please, if you want the people to come together, to come and contribute to something or attend a meeting, to come and eat, do it in week 4, because don't disturb people week 1, 2, and 3 because they are doing something for themselves and for everybody, but facing a lot of trouble because people are not on the same page in many instances. So 3 themes unfolded because this is an article I'm trying to write and I don't have the time because Kelly giving me too much papers to mark. So we're working on this, and the themes are the adoption of traditional ecological knowledge as part of the operation. For them, it's for the younger youths who come out of school, it's a new learning activity for them to relearn how the elders have been sustainably using their land, and of course, support their resilience in terms of climate crisis. Practical contribution by the enterprises and community-driven projects in response to climate-induced disasters, as I have told you, how they manage to try and work with whatever hazards they have, and aid community resilience through most of these projects are for collective well-being, whereby we don't want anybody to be left behind, to a good tautoko activity or working together. In conclusion, I'm facing and I'm trying to research at the moment the short-term benefit versus long-term visions. The people in these communities want money every day or every week. The long-term vision of growing crops, and then you have benefit after a few months or years, is we're still trying to explain this very well to them. And of course, they have responsibilities elsewhere. The gold rush attitude and subservient mindset, and that's a different topic altogether, how the colonial authorities had been using the subservient mindset and attitude of our people, that they have to listen, that they have to be respectful, that they don't have to speak up for any decision. That's why it's really hindering our people from innovation, from innovative thinking, that they can work themselves and they can be somebody in the future. We're trying to work on that. Sharing the vision, getting everybody on the same page, it's difficult. How do we do that? The politics and rationality, we talk about politics, modern democracy. Man, come to Fiji. Come and realize our indigenous Fijian politics about land, about relationship. It's a different story, but how do we navigate that? Modern amenities, vessel and retention. When you go to Fiji, these youths, all they want is this life. They want modern amenities. they want internet 24/7, they want electricity. And in order for those communities to do that, they're gonna, use their land and maybe commercialization, or at times mining or other, activities that really destroy a lot of life and life systems. But I've been teaching at Canterbury for a few months, and I've realized that they really want the life of sustainability. When I talked about my case study, oh, we really love that life. And I told them, go to Fiji, go and ask your peers around that. They want your life. So, these perspectives, the differences, they want this life, because for us here in countries like Australia and New Zealand, we've lived that life. And now we realize that we need more sustainability and so forth. Individualism, which is the same thing, capital accumulation versus collective well-being. People will come to me and say, oh, I've got a huge farm. Why do I need to work together with all of those people? But we tell them, these are your relations. We don't want to, what capitalism has done to us, that the rich people keep on getting rich. We want to change that, alternative ways of getting people together. We are in this boat together at the journey. Food security is the foundation. I realized that in order to drive something in these traditional settings, you need to have food security, especially for the women or for the males to go and camp in the forest on their farms for 1 or 2 weeks. You need food right near the houses. That's why we developed that communal food security project, that women and children have access to very healthy food right near their home. Lifestyle, modernization, capitalism, and versus sustainable futures, as well as climate variation, which will mean they need to readapt. Even their signal system, early signal systems, are totally challenged at the moment, and they need to reevaluate and readapt. Thank you. Did I go over time?
That's all good. That's all good. So really, thank
sorry.
you very much for your very, very rich presentation. I think you really made it clear how very rich and diverse the agricultural practices that are based on indigenous knowledge systems are. Looking at calendars, work schedules, communal labor. It's really fascinating, very interesting. And you also echoed that Kelly's point of the importance of learning to be affected, learning to listen to the environment, being sensitive to the sea, right? Giving some time for the environment to restore itself. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
So we go to our last presenter, and he's our guest, a friend. We actually have been inviting him to join our research network. So that's why maybe after this, he'll join in, join our research network. So I met him in a conference too, 3 months ago, for the Sustainability and Development Institute of the University of Michigan. So he presented this research, and I thought, it's very related to what we're doing and what we're interested in. So that's why I invited him to co-convene this panel. So the next presenter is Jean Quaton. His presentation is entitled Promises and Pitfalls of Social Capital to Climate Change Adaptation of an Indigenous Cultural Community in the Philippines. So, Jean?
Yes, thank you very much, Justin. Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yes,
can you
but
hear?
your video
Yep.
is off.
Yeah, I've been trying to turn it on, but it says that you can start your video because the host has stopped it. Start my video. Yeah, great. I'm in. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations, and I could say that what we do and the projects that we did before are really interrelated, and they're really the same, just different maybe in places, but very a lot of similarities in terms of our findings. For this particular presentation, I'll be sharing a part of our project before that looked into the local indigenous knowledge for disaster risk reduction of the Mamanoas. They are migrant indigenous peoples in the Visayas, which was hit by Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. I myself am a survivor of Super Typhoon Haiyan, and Actually, just November 8th, we commemorated the 8th year since the typhoon. The first paper was published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and this presentation was submitted and is currently under review at the Third World Quarterly Journal, entitled Promises and Pitfalls of Social Capital to Climate Change Adaptation of an Indigenous Cultural Community in the Philippines. I wrote this together with Yvonne, who is currently based at York University in Canada. I would like to start by reminding everyone that currently different groups, institutions, and countries are negotiating at Glasgow during the Conference of Parties for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and other efforts. And that according to the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, they reported that in the next few years, we are in a state of extreme impacts and varying impacts of climate change, and that we acknowledge that these impacts have different and varying effects to different communities, and that we really need to investigate how different communities adapt to this. So we bank on two major frameworks on climate change adaptation, as well as social capital. We adopted Parry as well as Berangford's conceptualizations of adaptation that are divided into three types: the coping, incremental, and transformational. For our community, we believe that their adaptation strategies and activities are more towards coping adaptation, which are more individualistic and community-driven and it's in the short term. We also used Putnam as well as Wilcox's conceptualizations of social capital and its different types: bonding, bridging, and linking. And we wanted to link these two to look at how social capital helps them cope, adapt to the changing climate. So as you can see here, this is the community of the Mamanuas. They are migrant indigenous peoples in the Philippines. They originally, why is it moving? They are originally settlers of Caraga in Mindanao, but they had to migrate up north to Visayas because of intermittent military conflicts in their area. So they've been living, they've been living in Basay for since 1950s, since the late 1950s, after the Second World War. So the main motivation why I did this research, because I conducted this when I was still a lecturer back in Leyte Normal University in Tacloban. Because I've been attending different conferences, high-end related, DRR, CCA related conferences in Tacloban as well as in Manila. And little has been, documented or even discussed about how the indigenous peoples and indigenous cultural communities were affected compared to what was reported in mainstream media. So I said that, okay, is there an indigenous cultural community in my particular region? Because most IPs in the Philippines, we have more than 110 ethno-linguistic groups. They are mostly found in the northern island as well as in the southern island. But in our region, they said that there is no indigenous, when we say indigenous community that has been living there for a very long time. So they said that they were able to identify, the Department of Social Welfare and Development told us that they have communities like Mamanuas, the Badjaos, who are scattered in the region, but technically they cannot be considered as someone or as a community that really belongs to our region. So that really sparked my interest. Then, so I decided to contact this community via their chieftain. They have a female chieftain, and it was really challenging at first. And later, we will find out why it was very challenging. We had to do at least 2 to 3 visits first, initial visit, before we got the nod, the green light to proceed with the study, because they were very, what's this, critical as well as uncomfortable participating. And we found the reason after interviewing and talking with them. We did this starting in December 2018, multiple field visits in 2018 up until October 2019. I think we were even able to still visit them early January in 2020. But when the pandemic happened, we didn't have any contact anymore, since their area was quite isolated and has difficult internet connection as well as phone signals. So we were able to conduct in-depth interviews as well as focus group discussions with 18 adult Mamanwas. So they live in this, and if you can see the arrow, in this small community right now. This is considered their transitional housing post-Haiyan, because before they were living in the hinterlands of Basay, away and isolated from the local Basaynons, the local people of their municipality. So currently they are situated in Situispal, and comprised of around 30 households comprising of 120 individuals or so. So we wanted to look at the potentials of their ties, intra and inter-organizational ties and networks, and how they use it. How is it useful? Is it something that they even know, and that they, how do you call this? That they deliberately utilize in terms of getting programs and services for them, especially for their everyday needs. So these are the main findings of the positive side of Mamanwa social capitals. We found that they have strong bonding social capital ties that they use in ensuring communal security in times of extreme weather events like the Super Typhoon Haiyan. They also have strong bonding social capitals that let them have food and livelihood in the everyday. I would like to expound on the experience pre, during, and post Haiyan. It was interesting because they were very, when we already got their approval and their trust, and we were communicating and talking casually, they were very proud to share that, you know what, Jin, we know of the impending doom even before it happened, like even days or weeks even before it happened, because we were already preparing for it. We know that there is a strong typhoon or a calamity that would happen, and we were already warned by our elders. The chieftain has already instructed us to build the korob. It's like their communal shelter, relocation shelter during typhoons as well as strong winds. So they said that we were ready. We were ready. We know that we are going to experience something bad. So we already harvested our crops, built the korob, and made sure that everyone was there. So when the typhoon happened, no one died. And they also shared that even before, since time immemorial, since their known history, they haven't experienced any casualty during extreme weather events like typhoons or earthquakes or or flooding. And they said that it's because we trust each other. We heed the advice of our elders. We heed the advice of our leaders. And that this knowledge, just this generational knowledge, have been passed down to us from one generation to another. And we deliberately teach our youth, our children, about what we know. Our katutubong katutubo or indigenous knowledge, their traditional knowledge. So that's a very interesting findings that we had. But we also said we also realized that if not for the strong bonding ties that hold them, these different households wouldn't have listened to the warnings of their elders, as well as to the instruction of their female chieftain. Another findings that we have is that they have strong social capital ties in ensuring food and livelihood availability. This is, for example, like in the findings of Justin, they said there's bayanihan. In their culture, they have what we call araglayun or pintakasi, wherein they help each other out in terms of preparing the land. They are subsistence farmers. Since they are migrant indigenous peoples in Basay, they don't own any land. They only borrow from the non-IP locals in Basay to cultivate, and they help each other out, because if they don't help each other out, they acknowledge that many of the households and many of their community members would go hungry. So they said that it's not about how big or small of a harvest that they get per household. It's making sure that each household has a harvest, and we can only do this by helping each other out through physical labor, because they don't have the money, they don't have the financial capacity to, help each other, but more on the labor, especially in their livelihood. But the negative side, or the not so good side of their social capital, is that they have weak bridging social capitals with the general non-IP residents of Basay, because they shared to us that since their migration to Eastern Visayas, to our region, they've moved to different places multiple times. They went to Eastern Samar, that's a different province. Then they went to Samar, that's also a different province. I think after 5 or 10 years, because they were always being bullied, being discriminated, and being harassed by non-indigenous people there. So they said that they decided to live in the hinterland in order to live in peace, in order to avoid the general population. So in this process, they were not able to, build a relationship, a familiar or a good relationship with the non-IP residents in Basay. Another thing is that they have fragile bridging social capital with the landowners of the piece of land that they are cultivating, because they said, we asked them, so, okay, you told us that you don't have any land here, but you're still able to plant like rice or vegetables and other root crops. And they said that, yes, it's because some of the non-IPs who have spare land, those that they do not use because it's in the hinterland, they lend this land to the Mamanuas for free. But that would depend on how big, the size and the tenure or the length of usage would depend to the landowner. So anytime, they just said that anytime they could just tell us to stop or not plant in the next season, and we couldn't do anything about it. So they said that they make sure that they remain friendly, they remain respectful, they sometimes even give free labor to that landowner to cultivate the different land that landowner has. So that's very one-sided. They said that they really have to rely on the goodwill as well as compassion of these non-IP landowners, just, you know, to have a land that they could grow their crops, have food, and like even have minimal income that they could sell with to the market and gain very minimal income. Another one is that they have weak linking social capital ties with the local and national government agencies. In fact, they shared to us that it was only after Haiyan that they were known by the different national government and regional government agencies working in Eastern Visayas, that they were provided livelihood, education, and different social services. But at the same time, although they were given these different programs, they could not really negotiate for how long and for what particular livelihood or education services that they want, that is, you know, that is reflective of their culture, that is reflective of what they know and what they want to achieve in the future, So they don't have any negotiating power with this national and regional government agencies, although they closely work with the National Commission for Indigenous People. NCIP, or the National Commission for Indigenous People, only serves as the coordinating agency, not the direct service provider. And there is no office of NCIP in the region. It's in region 6 and 7. So they could only rely through digital communication using their cell phones.
Sorry, Jane, you have 5 minutes.
Yep. Another example is their weak linking social capital with the local government unit, especially during elections, wherein they are promised many things by different running candidates, but when these candidates win, they don't get anything. Lastly, the different NGOs and private groups that went to their community and promised many things, and they were taken pictures, they were given us they were written a story, but these different organizations didn't go back after they got what they wanted. So if you can, and another one is the we wanted to also highlight the dark side of social capital, wherein we think that although the Mamanwas have these strong bonding social capital ties, this also hindered them from bridging meaningful linking as well as bridging social capital ties with other groups, institutions, and organizations in Basay. So I wanted to end it by saying that there are positive impacts and as well as negative impacts or contributions of social capital, depending on how different groups, communities negotiate as well as navigate their way towards other institutions. As mentioned in the previous presentations, climate change adaptation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is contested by different groups, politics, economics, and social considerations, and that there is a need for the indigenous people considered as vulnerable groups to be heard and to be engaged genuinely in terms of policy review, policy formulation, as well as policy amendments. Because at the end of the day, these people mostly rely with themselves to adopt from climate change as well as extreme events, and that institutions mandated to help them, mandated to provide social services as well as developmental projects to them, should listen to these people and really engage them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you so much for highlighting how, the importance of really engaging with the Mamanwas, how these people have lived, have survived, and have thrived in these areas for years. And we need to engage with them more because we have so much to learn from them and with them as well. So I guess, thank you so much for all our 4 presenters. Let me turn on my screen. So we have time for questions. You can turn on your screens. I guess looking at the participants list now, it's only Kat Gibson and Jessica who are not part of the panel. So if you have any questions to any of the presenters, you're more than welcome to.
Sorry
to
if I took quite some time in the presentation.
No, that's all good. We are very flexible. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question. I just appreciate the papers. They are fantastic. And it's a pity our friend from, was it Fiji, had to leave, I guess. Yeah, because that was a fascinating study. All of them were incredible, just to show the wealth of experiences that people have to deal with climate uncertainty and how, to some extent, they've been so ignored. And I guess Anne and I have got a paper, a similar kind of paper that we've submitted to the special issue, which looks at, the long history of people dealing with climate uncertainty, especially in regions that have had monsoonal changes. Every year you have such major variation in weather. So I was very interested to hear, Jin, your analysis, or at least the way in which the people you talked about how they knew that this was coming, and all the preparations they took to actually not to survive. And it's a similar case with the group that Anne has worked with in the up in Batanes, up in the way north area, where they had a huge, this was long before this, a typhoon, many people, ships were washed up onto the land and so on. And again, no lives were lost because people had the knowledge, the local knowledge of how to cope. And yet the study that I did in my research was in Mindanao, where people were migrants from the Visayas to Mindanao and only in a few generations and have got none of that experience. But I guess that raised the question for me, why the Indigenous group had moved from Mindanao to the Visayas when so many of the other migrants in the Mindanao have come from the Visayas. So was it related that these Visayans were moving to Mindanao and the Indigenous people had to move out? Or you said it was related to the military. So I'm just interested in finding out about in the 50s, because that's the same time that all the Visayans moved to Mindanao. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, for that. Actually, in the paper that we published in IJDRR, we created different tables that describe the different ways that the Mamanwas, look and examine the different celestial bodies, the different animal behaviors, even the movement of the winds and the sound of the animals. So that's one part of that. I just didn't discuss it in my presentation since I was focusing on the social capital. Going back to your question, from what we know during our FGDs and interviews, they said that post Second World War, they had to migrate with the help of the Basaynons that were living with them in Surigao. They had to migrate because they were harassed by the militaries as well as the non-IP locals from the ancestral land that they were living in. So they had to move up north, going to Basay, where their friends who are Basaynons live. But then when they went to Basay, they only lasted for at least 5 or 10 years. They also had to move to Samar in San Jose de Buan because the non-IP locals in Basay were also harassing them. Basay is actually home to insurgent groups also. They are it is a well-known location of insurgent groups there, even up until now. And so they moved to San Jose de Buan in Samar. Then the same harassment and paramilitary harassments happened again. So they moved to Dolores in eastern Samar. Then the same happened because in Dolores and in San Jose de Buan there are different insurgent groups, and since they consider themselves as, you know, forest people, tawuhan mga bukid, they consider this forest people. They whenever they move to a different place, they always choose something or somewhere in the hinterlands because it's where they do their livelihood. It's basically the environment that they are comfortable and where they can, you know, they know how to get food even without any employment. So when they move to these different cities and different places, unfortunately, it's also the place where the different rebels and insurgent groups are living or, you know, grouping together. So in late 2000, they had to go back to Basay. Some went to Marabot, some went to Southern Leyte, to different provinces. So they're actually everywhere in the different provinces of our region. But, you know, very small groups. They try to keep to themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, though, in the Filipino context to highlight that knowledge that they have and the way in which both, whether it's capitalist development of forestry or mining, or whether it's sort of insurgents who have got their own agendas, both have kind of been really, you know, oppressing these particular people who have such interesting knowledge. So, but anyway, thanks for that. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may add, it's actually interesting because they said that although they know about this, as much as they want to share this local knowledge, they're kind of afraid to share it because they've experienced this discrimination. They were laughed at when they tried warning the locals in Basay before Haiyan happened. So they just said, okay, they're not listening and we are just receiving negative comments, unwanted comments. So let's just keep our mouth shut and, you know, live our lives in isolation. That's what they said. And when we asked government officials, hey, we found that they have this very interesting knowledge which they think were helpful in surviving Haiyan. So how do you try to integrate this? And you know, the social worker said that as much as we also appreciate and wanted to integrate their programs, those in the upper levels of, you know, administration just doesn't want to, because they wanted to use something that they can prove more on scientific, this and that. So that's one thing that that really hinders or prevents their knowledge to be dispersed or to be shared to other people as well.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting thing that we could broaden out to the other contexts, like in Vietnam or Fiji or other parts. To what extent local governments or provincial governments get on side with recognising these knowledges. I know in the case that we worked with up in the north, the provincial government actually started to support some of the practices, for instance, the reciprocal practices around harvesting of grasses to put grass thatched roofs rather than using corrugated iron, which, you know, the iron which actually rusts and blows off and so on. And I think that's starting to happen a bit in the Pacific now, that there is a recognition of these other, you know, plant-based building materials as having a much better chance of surviving, or at least not killing people in the face of these incredible events. And I'd be interested to hear from your colleague, Kelly, about that in Fiji, because he was producing so much information about.
Oh, I know. He's amazing. You can imagine how on fire he is in a lecture.
Yes.
Yeah. So he has talked about that before. And what's really interesting is some of the projects he's presented on, he actually started. So it's on land that he is responsible for, and he's responsible for the livelihoods of those young people. So a lot of the work he was talking about is actually his own work, but he's too humble to say that.
His own action research, really, sort of.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, and the reason, and I was thinking about Catherine's comment there about social capital and your use of the word social capital, Jen. And when Sully first came here, he kept wanting me to write papers with him on social capital, and I kept saying a bit like what Catherine was saying there, that, oh, I don't know, I don't really like translating everything into capital. And what he said to me, which really changed my mind, was that normally you can get loans based on your land as capital, but because they don't want to put the land up for capital, and they can't get loans based on collectively owned land, what they're trying to do is to frame the social capital of the community as such an asset, a huge asset, that they can invest in innovation and business to the degree that they could also get loans. So I thought, oh, that's actually a really like performative, interesting use of social capital that I hadn't really understood.
They could get
myself.
collateral.
Yeah.
It was actually interesting because when we talked to them, that although they recognize that anytime the landowner may or may not let them use it for free, they said that it's been happening for like more than 10 years, and so far they didn't let them stop using the land, because they said that what's in it for the landowner, you know, for letting them use it for free apart from altruism. They said that, you know what, Jane, they let us use it because we also in turn protect the land from the rebels, because instead of not having caretakers in the hinterlands, when the rebels know that they are actively cultivating, it also gives them this preventive measure of, you know, the rebel taking the land. Yes, protection as a way protection. So that's one interesting findings also that we have.
Did you guys want to talk about Catherine's comment? Because I'm looking at the time, we have 15 minutes left. Do you want to, have you read Catherine's comment and finding that common linguistic ground for our paper? What did you think? And I want to draw on the expertise of Kelly and Kat here. Because you are the experts.
Before you get onto that, I've just been thinking about the tool that we developed in Take Back the Economy, where we tried to put together people's kind of work portfolio together with their ecological footprint. And we used the example of an Australian miner and a Filipino farmer. And we then did the 24-hour clock of the different kinds of work, labour they do, different kinds of work and transactions, and then expanded it to kind of show to what extent they were living within a global One Earth footprint, or whether we're expanding it or not. And I just wondered whether that technique could be some way of trying to help value what people are doing in these contexts. Like if we were to actually do an ecological footprint for the group you've just with Jin, or the group that, I can't remember his name, but the Suri, is it? Yeah, it was
Sully
in Fiji. That getting young people particularly into actually doing that calculation and showing what it is that they're actually, that is a way of valuing what they have. And it's also a way of coming back to the students in Canterbury or whatever to say, you do your, you're trying to be environmentally, respectable and responsible. Let's do your ecological footprint and let's see where it is compared to this one over here. And is there some way that there can be some kind of exchange around this? I'm just trying to think of how we can help to value these practices, particularly for young people, because young people are obviously, we all should be, are concerned about the future. So why not reflect back to the young people the way in which they're actually doing what so many other people in the West want to be able to do, and it's perhaps something that you could do to LGAs too, to local government units, to say, actually, if we kind of put a gauge of which local government units have populations that are working within their ecological footprint, the kind of ranking of LGUs might be quite different than if we're thinking about which of the ones that have the most economic growth or something like that. And I just wondered whether it's a strategy that we could start to roll out a bit more to try and think about those connections.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think Sully's actually teaching the course that I put together based on Take Back the Economy. So I'll check in with him because I know he was using those tools in the classroom. But it would be interesting to, I mean, obviously he hasn't been able to travel back home for a couple of years now. But it would be interesting to think about returning to Fiji and doing some of that work or doing it via distance as a way of creating information about that and even the connections between our classroom and that group.
Yeah, so it almost feels like it's a form of offsetting, like carbon offsetting. You know, people buy so many trees to be able to fly. Well, wouldn't there be some way we could actually be offsetting? I mean, we want to change our ecological footprint. Is there some way of valuing the ecological footprint that's for less than one world and actually helping people not to become like us, but to stay like that, but with other benefits like good health, good access to internet or something? But there could be a people-to-people form of environmental offsets that aren't tied just to the fossil fuel industry. But anyway, I'm just trying to think about this economic prototyping idea that we might discuss tomorrow.
Yeah, well, Sully's got some funding. He's in another project on innovation. Which is trying to reframe Pacific practices as already innovative and as transferable and can travel to other parts of the world. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Well, it'll be interesting to have a talk to him when things settle down and come back to that idea too. But he said he's really interested in contributing to this paper. That you guys are planning. And on the question of shared language, I think I think it's worth thinking about more. But I outline that you sent around, right? It was mainly around post-development thinking. Is that right?
Yeah. Sorry, I can you
The framework on post-development, Justin.
Yep. Did you want me to share that here so we can briefly talk about that, or?
Yeah, put it up on the screen.
Because Kat, you're welcome to join us here.
Yeah, actually, you know what? I might dip out because I have to prepare for another, not a Liviana thing, but a meeting with Europeans around their social economy projects and teaching that starts in a little while and is going to go for a few hours. I might just give myself a break and let you guys continue, but it was a fascinating. Thanks so much, Justin and Jin, for organising it. And it was great to hear what, the Vietnam research, Kelly. It was just, terrific. So much. I feel like there's so much richness there in what we're doing. And it's a matter of, pulling it out there, making it be more assertive about it in a way. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just dip out now.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen.
Sure.
There. So we have 10 minutes to briefly discuss. My question is really, I'm just thinking about this. My question is really on the theory, like which theory would we be departing from? The theoretical departure, because I'm not really sure that Well, what did you guys think? Because looking at the themes, it's really this one, right? More than human, indigenous, knowledge, community-driven, everyday adaptations. And then I'm thinking of drawing upon this paper, which is at the end of the paper, they were asking this question of whether is it time to whether scholarship and practice of adaptation take this kind of a post-development turn. I'm just wondering if you think that that's a good theoretical framing for the paper, or what are your thoughts? I think we're going to draw on.
I think it's a great I don't know if you can hear me, but my children are screaming outside, so that's why I keep turning it off. I think it's a great idea to start with, epistemologies of the South and the pluriverse, and the engaging with other ontologies, right? So what you've got there to me makes a lot of sense. It's just a matter of being, and that is a theoretical framework, right? So you could review that literature, but with an eye to climate change, which I don't think De Souza Santos and Escobar is to an extent in designs for the pluriverse talking about climate change. But so that could actually be your theoretical framework, is epistemologies of the South, designs for a pluriverse. And then you could also use the work that Stephen Healy and Bhavya have been engaging with Anup Da, World of the Third. Have you engaged with
the World of the Third?
Yeah,
I've heard of that. I'll have a look at that too.
Yeah, so I mean, they're using his
Kelly, you're choppy.
He's
Kelly.
also a member of the Community Economies Research Network. Sorry, maybe I've stopped my video. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So World of the Third is Anup Da's work, and it's trying to push back against the one world that Westerners tend to assume, right? That there's just one world out there and we're all in the same world adapting to the same climate change. Whereas I think what Escobar would say is that we're kind of in worlds that are crossing over, but not exactly aligned, right? And so I think that's a good start point for that theoretical framework. So then what is how do we think about climate change adaptation in and through those theories?
Frameworks, yeah.
And then maybe diverse economies and community economies actually helps us to do that, because it allows us to map out the diversity of practices that people are already engaged in, and then to build ethical kind of community adaptations that are built on those multiple worlds, right? Doesn't ask us to be all in the same world. And so then that gives us a framework to talk about our case studies in really rich and articulate ways, because we don't have to say that all the case studies are the same thing, right? They all illustrate ways of adapting based on different epistemological and ontological frameworks, which is like more than scientific. I don't know, what do you think, Huang? I think this is your kind of area as well.
I think the concept of indigenous worldviews or varying worldviews could be helpful there.
Yeah.
What do you think, Huang? Do you agree? Can hear you though.
I think that is very interesting, and also kind of like very lovely, like theoretical framework. Just adding quite small point. So related to the climate change adaptation. So basically now they're talking a lot about transformation, and actually Pearlings and Karen O'Brien. So they actually wrote a lot papers and books around that. And actually, I think in Philippines and also in Vietnam as well. So the government, they are now also pushing forward for the NBS, so nature-based solutions. And also, yes, and like CSI. And also CSA, so like climate smart agriculture too. Yes, so it's really much, it's like show the opportunities and the potential to going forward for that. So just like we might kind of like a bit connect with actually the government, who will, because like we can't do it by ourselves, our indigenous people or our little farmer is have to go together with others. As in our paper we already said, the politics is everywhere, and for adaptation we have to go along with that. We can't kind of like, okay, we do what we want and not kind of align with the politics there. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that is
so how
more,
do we build partnerships
Yeah.
in those difficult politics? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm just reviewing what we've talked about. I think so. We'll start with, and correct me if I'm wrong. This is how I understand it. We'll start it with framing it from the perspective of. I'll review these articles, the pluriverse, looking at the work of the World of the Third, De Sousa Santos, Epistemology of the South, and then try to relate it, see how it's connected to climate change adaptation, and then relate to the framework of diverse economies to allow us to map out this diverse adaptation practices that exist. And then we go through the 4 different case studies from different communities, and then find ways to find similar patterns and try to address that question. So what
or
I'll
even
do,
not similar patterns, right? We can just say here's a range of approaches to partnership for climate change adaptation. Like obviously, for example, in Vietnam, the government is so central to everything that it doesn't make sense to then say, oh, leave it up to everybody by themselves, right? But then in other parts of the world, like where Sully is in Fiji, it's totally possible for communities to do their own adaptation and then ask government to support them in their adaptation. So I think the benefit of using that theoretical framework is that we can kind of let the case studies sit alongside each other to show a number of different approaches, like a chocolate box where you can pick the one that best fits your desires and needs. And then it's a very easy way to build a paper, right? Because we can hold them together. The only other thing I would add is that it's useful to set up the problematic first, right? So my understanding of the problem, which I think Huang and I talk a little bit in our paper, is that the way of thinking that presumes one reality, one Western kind of best practice for everyone is what caused climate change. So we can't get out of climate change with the same thinking that got us into it, right? So that's, I don't know if that's too Eurocentric a way and putting too much on Western industrialization and science, but I do think there's something there that actually that thinking where humans are separate from nature, humans have control over nature, humans are special and can dominate and are more important than all of the other more than human beings. Like that is part of our problem. And so then you can lead into the, okay, well, if that's the problem, how do we get out of it? It's by thinking through pluriverses and thinking through epistemologies of the South, because these are the places that didn't cause, if you know what I mean.
I think we could extend the humans are separate from nature. We could also extend it to like we cannot also adapt in one way. Communities cannot also adapt in one way.
Yeah, and it's concrete.
Sorry to
Thank you so much for that. Yep.
Hi, Kerry.
I am. Hey, by the way, everything's been really fascinating. I've been a little weird, creepy ghost listening to everything that's been said. But yeah, I really like it. Interestingly, Justin, the very first PhD proposal that I submitted and never went through with was climate change adaptation
Wow.
in the Indonesian coffee growing areas, and it would have literally, you know, I was supervised by Catherine, so obviously had the very post-development approach to
Wow.
things. I feel like it would have been very similar to where what you've done.
I'd love
But
to
anyway.
read more about it, Kerry.
No, I never went through with it, so I dropped out. I just wanted to say though, I'm going to actually open up another session now. I think I can have two going at the same time, but I'm not sure.
No, that's okay. We're also ending now, Kerry.
I don't
So
think you
what-
can normally have two the same. Yeah, so we better get
Yeah.
going.
Better get
Okay.
going. So I'll write it up and send you something, guys, by early next year, though, because I'll be very, very busy. I'm moving to
Okay.
Canberra soon.
No hurry.
So, you know, all
It's
of this.
okay.
I'll keep in touch
Okay.
via email. Thanks so much,
Thank you, everyone. This is a good
Thank
start.
you.
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see
Nice
you
to see
all.
you all.
Have a good
Bye.
Take
evening, everyone.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Huang.
Bye bye.